Dean Martin's life after 1987 was nothing anyone expected. To the public, he remained the effortless charmer, the man whose voice could melt hearts and whose smile lit up any room. But behind closed doors, everything had changed. What happens to someone when the person they loved most is taken from them, not gradually, but all at once? Dean Paul, his son, had been more than just a child. He had been the center of Dean Martin's world, the tether to a joy that even fame and fortune could never replace. When Dean Paul died, something within Dean Martin died as well, a part of him that no applause or spotlight could revive. For years he appeared to live among us, yet those who knew him could see the truth. The man everyone adored had vanished, replaced by a shell, a presence caught somewhere between life and grief. How does someone exist for 8 years without truly living, carrying only the echo of what once anchored their heart? The story that follows is not about the glitz or the laughter, the films or the crooner persona. It is about the quiet unraveling of a human being, a father, a friend, a man who loved so deeply that the loss became an invisible cage. What Dean endured after 1987 reshapes everything we thought we knew about him, revealing a profound vulnerability hidden beneath decades of charm. By the end of this story, you will understand the depth of his pain, the extremes of human grief, and the heartbreaking truth that sometimes love can outlive life itself. Dean Martin was more than a voice on the radio or a face in a film. He was a father, a husband, and a friend, a man whose warmth extended far beyond the stage lights. To those who knew him personally, Dean was both larger than life and profoundly human. His laughter could fill a room, but so could his quiet moments of reflection, the times he simply sat with his children or shared a cigarette with a longtime friend, listening more than speaking, absorbing the world in a way most of us rarely do. How often do we truly see the people behind the persona, the carefully constructed charm that the public so easily embraces? Dean's life was a constant balancing act, the cool, effortless entertainer that millions adored, and the deeply loving father who carried the weight of unspoken worries, fears, and regrets. Friends recall that he had a way of making anyone feel like the most important person in the world, yet even in those moments, there was a shadow he could not entirely escape. He adored his children, particularly Dean Paul, whose energy and presence seemed to bring a new light into his father's life. Watching him with his family, you saw tenderness mixed with a quiet anxiety, an awareness that life could change in an instant, though he never let that anxiety show on screen. He was both invincible and vulnerable, a juxtaposition that gave him depth beyond the songs and movies. Those closest to him describe afternoons spent laughing over shared memories, yet evenings often found Dean staring at photographs of the past, a subtle melancholy hinting at a heart that felt more than it could express. Even colleagues in the entertainment world noticed it. Dean's charm never faltered on stage, but there was a solemnity behind the curtain, a part of him that belonged to the people he loved most and nowhere else. How did a man capable of such effortless joy also carry such profound sorrow? This duality defined him, yet few outside his inner circle could see it. The public knew Dean Martin as a symbol of cool, yet the truth, the reality of who he was hidden in small gestures and fleeting expressions that only those who shared his life could understand. By exploring this side of Dean, we start to understand the weight he carried, the delicate threads of love and loss that would later shape the 8 years of grief no one could prepare for. This is the Dean Martin no one talks about, the man whose humanity makes his story both tragic and deeply compelling, inviting us to see not just the entertainer, but the father, the friend, the human being who would soon face a loss so profound it would alter everything. And as we move forward, we begin to glimpse the first signs of the fracture that would ultimately define the final chapter of his life, a fracture the world would only understand in hindsight. The day Dean Paul died was a rupture that no words could ever repair, a sudden void that swallowed not only a son, but a part of Dean Martin himself. How do you reconcile a life that seemed so full with a loss that feels infinite? For Dean, the grief was immediate and total, a shock that defied both his public persona and his own understanding of mortality. Those who were close recall the silence that descended over him in the hours after the accident, a quiet so profound that even Frank Sinatra, a man who had known Dean for decades, struggled to bridge it. How could someone so famously charismatic, so effortlessly charming, contain the devastation of losing a child? It was a grief that refused to be compartmentalized, one that would ripple outward and touch every corner of his existence. In those first moments, the man who could command a stage with ease was reduced to staring at a photograph, at a name, at a memory, as if trying to summon Dean Paul back with sheer will alone. Family members watched helplessly as he moved through rooms with a hollowed gaze, speaking less and less, as though the words themselves had fled in protest. Friends and colleagues alike sensed a fracture, a subtle but unmistakable change in demeanor that suggested the very core of Dean Martin had shifted. The world outside may have seen only the composure of a celebrity, yet those closest to him understood the collapse underneath, the private storm that would define the years ahead. How does a man continue to exist when the person you nurtured, guided, and loved is gone, and there is nothing you can do to reclaim them? Dean's response was neither immediate nor conventional. He did not throw himself into work or distraction. Instead, he lingered in the spaces that Dean Paul had occupied, clinging to traces of presence, the echo of laughter, the scent of a room unchanged. Even as the entertainment industry tried to pull him back into the light of public life, he could not respond. The absence was too great, the loss too profound. Colleagues describe attempts at conversation that ended in silence or in references to his son, a poignant reminder that for Dean, nothing else mattered anymore. Every morning he would wake and confront the reality that Dean Paul would never return, and each evening he would lay his grief carefully aside, only to have it resurface with a force that defied reason. How does a man continue to exist when the person who anchored his heart is gone? The answer, as the years would show, is that he could not fully exist. That grief, sudden and unrelenting, would not simply heal with time, but instead would reshape him entirely, carving out a place of absence that nothing else could fill. And so, from the very first day, the stage was set for a story of loss so profound it would leave an indelible mark not only on Dean Martin's life, but on everyone who knew him. A human drama hidden behind the mask of stardom, waiting for the world to see what had always been there, the depth of a father's love and the unimaginable cost of its loss. After Dean Paul's death, the world watched Dean Martin continue to exist, but those closest to him knew something fundamental had shifted. How does a man who once commanded stages and captured hearts with effortless charm suddenly become a stranger in his own life? In the years that followed, Dean withdrew into a shadow of himself, moving through daily routines with a hollow precision that unsettled everyone around him. Meals went untouched unless someone physically placed food before him, and clothing lay untouched unless carefully prepared by a housekeeper. The vibrancy that had defined him, the laughter, the jokes, the easy warmth, faded into an almost spectral presence. Friends and family began to realize that the Dean Martin they knew, the man who could light up a room with a smile, was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable, someone who existed but no longer truly lived. He spoke less, often directing conversations as if his son were still present, asking for advice on trivial and profound matters alike, creating an eerie rhythm where reality and memory blurred. What must it feel like to live every day in a world that has moved on while your heart remains trapped in the past? For Dean, this was not metaphorical. He drove to cemeteries, conversed with gravestones, and carried on as if Dean Paul were still walking beside him.
Friends like Frank Sinatra tried repeatedly to reach him, to pull him back into life, only to be met with polite detachment or references to his son, reminders that no performance, no camaraderie could fill the void left by such a loss. Even his professional life ceased to matter. Contracts remained unsigned, bills unpaid, opportunities ignored. The industry that once celebrated him could not penetrate the fortress of grief he had built around himself. Observers describe encounters with him in public as surreal. Dean would approach young men who bore any resemblance to Dean Paul, calling them by his son's name, his voice carrying the gentle insistence of a father trying to reclaim what reality had taken. And as the years passed, the toll became visible. He lost weight, aged rapidly, and appeared almost translucent, as if grief were literally consuming him from the inside out. What is extraordinary, yet painfully human, is the consistency of this withdrawal. It was not a collapse that ebbed and flowed. It was a persistent state, a new way of being that lasted 8 years. Loved ones began to understand that this was not a temporary grief, not a phase of mourning that would eventually fade. Dean Martin had entered a liminal space where life continued mechanically, but the essence of living, the laughter, the connection, the curiosity, had been surrendered to memory. Each day he repeated rituals that anchored him to his son, but simultaneously pushed him further from the living world. And in this quiet persistence, the tragedy became clear. Dean had not only lost his child, he had lost himself. The world saw the dates on a calendar, marking the passage of time, but those who loved him saw a man suspended between life and death, walking among the living as a ghost whose presence was felt more than acknowledged, whose grief had transformed him into a cautionary figure of love so profound that the body and mind could no longer reconcile the absence. For 8 long years, friends, family, and colleagues tried tirelessly to pull Dean Martin back into the world of the living, but every effort seemed to dissolve against an invisible wall he had built around himself. How do you reach someone who has retreated so completely into grief that reality no longer registers? Frank Sinatra, who had shared decades of laughter, music, and history with Dean, made repeated visits, sometimes arriving unannounced, calling out for his old friend with a warmth that once could have filled any room. And yet, Dino's responses were polite but detached, each conversation a mirror reflecting only the absence of his son. "I'm waiting," Dean would say, a single phrase that carried both hope and impossibility, leaving even the most patient hearts in quiet despair. Jerry Lewis, despite a complicated past with Dean, approached with concern and familiarity, attempting to engage him with memories of their shared successes and camaraderie. But it was as if Dean's mind had erased everything except the presence of Dean Paul. Other recollections, other joys, fell flat against the weight of loss. Have you ever witnessed someone so consumed by grief that all attempts at connection seem meaningless, not for lack of love, but for the immensity of the absence they carry? Family members faced this impossible truth daily, watching a man they loved more than anything become unrecognizable. Conversations about simple matters, career decisions, or even dinner were met with blank stares or references to his son, as if Dean Paul's guidance was the only compass he trusted. And yet, despite the futility, no one gave up. Every visit, every call, every gentle attempt was an act of devotion, a stubborn refusal to surrender the man who once brought so much light into their lives. But with each failed attempt, the emotional weight grew heavier, the heartbreak more acute, and the realization settled in. Grief can be a force so profound that even love cannot penetrate it. What does it mean when your presence, your words, your care are met with silence, with withdrawal, with the soft refusal of someone lost inside their own mind? It is a struggle both universal and deeply personal, the desire to reach someone who cannot be reached, the frustration of watching a loved one fade while knowing they are still physically present. Friends of the entertainment world, used to success, applause, and easy influence, confronted their limits in a way they never imagined, discovering that the brightest stars can cast the deepest shadows when grief takes hold. And yet, in this relentless persistence, there is a quiet heroism, a recognition that connection matters, even when it seems impossible, even when it is refused. Every effort, every visit, built a tension that whispered of eventual resolution, though no one could yet imagine what form it would take. There was hope that Dean might one day return fully, that the man who had shared stages and laughter with legends could reclaim even a fragment of life. And the audience senses this tension building, waiting for the moment when grief and presence finally intersect, setting the stage for a climactic and heart-wrenching revelation. Over the years that followed Dean Paul's death, the world watched the vibrant, effortless charm of Dean Martin fade into something almost unrecognizable. How does a man who could light up stages, command audiences with a wink or a smile, slowly vanish while still walking among us? Friends and family described him as translucent, a shadow of the man they once knew, as if each day stripped away a little more of his presence. He stopped caring for himself in the ways that once seemed automatic. Meals left untouched unless placed before him, clothing lay untouched unless carefully prepared by a housekeeper. The vibrancy that had defined him, the laughter, the jokes, the easy warmth, faded into an almost spectral presence. Friends and family began to realize that the Dean Martin they knew, the man who could light up a room with a smile, was gone, replaced by someone unrecognizable, someone who existed but no longer truly lived. He spoke less, often directing conversations as if his son were still present, asking for advice on trivial and profound matters alike, creating an eerie rhythm where reality and memory blurred. What must it feel like to live every day in a world that has moved on, while your heart remains trapped in the past? For Dean, this was not metaphorical. He drove to cemeteries, conversed with gravestones, and carried on as if Dean Paul were still walking beside him. Friends like Frank Sinatra tried repeatedly to reach him, to pull him back into life, only to be met with polite detachment or references to his son, reminders that no performance, no camaraderie could fill the void left by such a loss. Even his professional life ceased to matter. Contracts remained unsigned, bills unpaid, opportunities ignored. The industry that once celebrated him could not penetrate the fortress of grief he had built around himself. Observers describe encounters with him in public as surreal. Dean would approach young men who bore any resemblance to Dean Paul, calling them by his son's name, his voice carrying the gentle insistence of a father trying to reclaim what reality had taken. And as the years passed, the toll became visible. He lost weight, aged rapidly, and appeared almost translucent, as if grief were literally consuming him from the inside out. What is extraordinary, yet painfully human, is the consistency of this withdrawal. It was not a collapse that ebbed and flowed. It was a persistent state, a new way of being that lasted 8 years. Loved ones began to understand that this was not a temporary grief, not a phase of mourning that would eventually fade. Dean Martin had entered a liminal space where life continued mechanically, but the essence of living, the laughter, the connection, the curiosity, had been surrendered to memory. Each day he repeated rituals that anchored him to his son, but simultaneously pushed him further from the living world. And in this quiet persistence, the tragedy became clear. Dean had not only lost his child, he had lost himself. The world saw the dates on a calendar, marking the passage of time, but those who loved him saw
Each act, simple and repetitive, was a testament to a heart that refused to let go, yet could not sustain itself. Doctors and psychiatrists consulted by the family explain this as a kind of dissociative response to trauma, a psychological mechanism so profound that the body itself began to mirror the emptiness of the mind. His weight dropped significantly, his appearance aged rapidly, and every encounter with the outside world reinforced the sense of someone who had already departed, leaving only a hollow shell behind. How did the human body endure 8 years of what many would call a living death? Staff members recalled the eerie contrast. Dean would laugh quietly at memories of his son or carry on conversations with his grave, while simultaneously showing little interest in meals, work, or even greetings from old friends. The entertainment world's usual attempts to draw him back to the stage failed repeatedly, highlighting the impossible reality that grief, when this consuming, does not respond to fame, persuasion, or routine. This decline was both tragic and awe-inspiring. It revealed the depths of a father's love, the way devotion can persist beyond the physical, anchoring a person to loss so completely that survival itself becomes secondary. And yet, in the shadows of his decline, there was a quiet narrative of human resilience, the refusal to abandon connection with the one he had loved most, even when that refusal demanded the ultimate personal cost. Every day Dean endured, every hour he spent in this twilight existence built an invisible bridge between life and memory, carrying a devotion so deep that when his body finally ceased to function years later, the story was not of death alone, but of an unyielding bond that had outlasted the physical world and etched itself indelibly into the hearts of those who witnessed it. When Dean Martin finally passed away on December 25, 1995, it was not the moment that truly marked the end of his story. That had already occurred 8 years earlier, on the day Dean Paul was buried. What followed was a remarkable period in which the world's perception of Dean Martin, the carefree, charming crooner who seemed untouchable, clashed with the intimate, invisible grief he carried alone. Those closest to him understood the truth. Dean had been gone long before his body gave out, living in a space of memory and devotion that was inaccessible to everyone else. Frank Sinatra, his lifelong friend, delivered a eulogy that revealed this truth with heartbreaking clarity. "We're not here to mourn Dean Martin's death," he said, voice breaking. "We're here to acknowledge what we all knew for 8 years, that Dean died on March 24, 1987, the day we buried Dean Paul." In those words, the world glimpsed the depth of a father's love, a grief so profound it erased the man from the living world even as he remained physically present. Family members recalled the quiet heroism of his daily routines, the way he cared for his wife and daughters while speaking to the memory of his son, preserving Dean Paul's room, marking each day on the calendar, living a devotion that few could comprehend, yet everyone witnessed in fragments. Jerry Lewis, reflecting on those years, described it plainly. He was a ghost walking among us, waiting for the one he could not bear to lose. And yet, amid the sorrow, there is profound beauty in the story. Dean's life, especially the invisible years, teaches us about the transformative power of love, the way it can sustain, consume, and ultimately define us. How often do we measure devotion only in tangible moments, forgetting that unseen loyalty, quiet acts of remembrance, and emotional endurance are equally powerful? The reunion with Dean Paul, finally achieved in death, is a metaphor for all the unspoken reconciliations in life, the moments when our hearts catch up with reality, when grief finds its resolution, and when love transcends even the boundaries of mortality. For his children, for friends, and for fans around the world, the story of Dean Martin after 1987 becomes a lens through which we understand the stakes of connection, the cost of profound loss, and the extraordinary measures of the human heart. It asks us to pause and reflect. How do we honor those we have lost? How do we recognize the invisible struggles that accompany grief? Dean Martin's legacy is not merely the songs he sang or the laughter he inspired, but the testament of enduring love, the reminder that loss reshapes life in ways that are invisible yet monumental.
When we look back at his life, we are not simply remembering a star, we are witnessing a father's devotion that defied time, a spirit that clung to love so completely that the physical world could not contain it. In sharing this story, we are invited to recognize our own bonds, to reach out to those we care for, and to carry forward the quiet courage of sustaining love even when it feels unbearable. Dean Martin's life after 1987 was heartbreaking, yes, but it is also profoundly instructive. Love can both break us and define us, and the truest legacy is measured not in years lived, but in the depth of our devotion.